What my argument today and what I want to talk to you about is basically this. It's that for the last 30 years odd, both of the major parties, Labor and Liberal, have converged around a core of pretty common ideas about society, the economy, individual freedoms and the role of government. And the current political debate is being played out within some pretty narrow confines, and that this will continue to be the case until there's a circuit breaker. And that now, more than ever, a new voice is needed to help shift political debate to a position where it is more capable of addressing the challenges that are coming in the 21st century. So perhaps just first to start with a little bit of history and to make some pretty broad generalisations. For about the first two-thirds of the 20th century, we saw government take it upon itself to organise production and labour. So think of the Snowy Hydro project or post-war reconstruction efforts. But it also took it upon itself to spread its reach across a range of other areas of social life. And so housing or education, for example, started to become political questions during the first two-thirds of the 20th century. And especially in the post-war period, the notion of entitlement dominated much of political and social discourse, provided that you worked for your employer in accordance with rules that were set down, in accordance with arrangements negotiated between unions and government and business, you could be pretty much relaxed and know that the government was going to guarantee entitlements, such as the pension. Throughout all of this, of course, were some pretty highly gendered assumptions about who was going to do the work and who was going to do the caring. But these assumptions kind of crossed both major political parties. And perhaps it started in sometime around the 1970s or sometime in the 1980s, but certainly the Labor Party decided that it was time for a change was in order, and economic rationalism, or which is sometimes called neoliberalism, was to become the predominant ideology. And of course, the Liberal Party quickly agreed. Neoliberalism, or economic rationalism, as you probably know, involves privatisation of profitable public goods, organising of society according to principle of the market, many of the fiscal and monetary reforms of the 70s and 80s, and of course various forms of deregulation. And so it was a big change, because instead of providing citizens with guarantees, such as proper pensions, the state instead, or government instead, creates the opportunity for citizens to act as a kind of an entrepreneur, required to take opportunities and to make rational market-based decisions about their life. So superannuation replaces the pension, private health insurance replaces a public system, passengers on trains get referred to as customers when they can get on the trains, students at universities likewise. Choice replaces entitlement and opportunity replaces right. And cutting across all of this, again, embodied by both of the two parties, we have this very worrying trend to willingly suspend or to easily suspend basic human rights in the name of crisis or emergency, and something that we've seen quite a lot of in the last few years. So you can think of the terrorism laws, the special laws that remove the right to silence for workers in the building industry, the taking out of parts of Australia as not being really Australia for the purposes of migration, or the Northern Territory emergency intervention that suspended the basic human rights of Aboriginal people in Central Australia. All of those things enjoyed bipartisan support. And we've entered an era pretty much where these exceptional laws are now almost normal, and no one in the media really bats an eyelid when the Labor Party says, for example, it's going to roll out income management quarantining across the whole country and take away the basic free market principle that people have the right to control their own money and have basic human dignity. And so we have a two-party system where these ideas of emergency or pressing necessity have been so debased as to justify anything, and such as spending on the mining tax. If you remember that was the rationale that they used for spending ads on for the mining tax ads. And we have this idea of universal entitlement basically slowly ripped to shreds. And the idea of large-scale vision and nation-building projects are now essentially reduced to mean nothing more than throwing a stack of cash at a deregulated private sector to install insulation bats and then wondering why things go awry. And in a very practical sense, because of Australia's electoral system, the old parties conduct elections as if the only seats that matter a handful of marginals in Queensland or New South Wales, or sometimes in outer suburban Victoria. And so effectively the national debate ends up being centred around a few thousand voters. And rather than offer two big picture competing visions of competing ideologies, the major parties instead attempt through focus groups to divine the wishes of these few thousand voters and offer up to them their desires and hopefully get their votes. And unfortunately, at the very time that we need it most, the two major parties have emptied the public sphere of political imagination and vision. And I say the very time that we need it most is now, because there's a growing body of work, which I think is pretty much universally accepted by scientists, that is pointing towards actually a very real emergency, the climate emergency. Recent reports make for pretty grim reading if you sit down and look at them closely. It's clear that the world since pre-industrial levels has warmed by close to a degree, and that even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases tomorrow, lags in the climate system mean that we might be up somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees total warming since pre-industrial levels. And this talk of degrees is important. It's not going to be felt as a slightly warmer planet. The better analogy is with the human body. When your body gets a couple of degrees above its normal temperature, fever or hypothermia starts to set in if you go too far above or below. And you can't predict what's going to happen once you start to get above or below too many degrees. You might suffer irreparable damage, you might die, you just don't know. The risk is too high because there's a normal range. The scientists are saying that the potential tipping point for the planet is in fact possibly 2 degrees or possibly a bit less. And so even if we stopped emitting tomorrow, we run a very real risk that we would hit that tipping point. And the scientific consensus really is a heart-rending cry for urgent action. And in 2007, the State of the Science prompted United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon to plead, this is an emergency, and for emergency situations we need emergency action. And so I think we're at the stage where the scientists have spoken, and it's really now up to the humanities and the politicians and politics to craft solutions to our dilemma. And at the risk of being glib, for the reasons that I outlined earlier when going through that little history of where we were at the start of the 21st century, perhaps climate change has arrived at the wrong time. If it had arrived in the 1940s, it might have been a response similar to the war effort. Or if it arrived in the 1950s, we might have thought that it was like post-war reconstruction and it was all shoulders to the wheel to tackle this challenge. Now, however, it comes on the scene in a world saturated by markets where even the major parties' political imagination doesn't extend beyond getting some volunteer army to do the work, or perhaps creating another carbon trading scheme which will give those responsible for the financial crisis yet another instrument to play with. And, of course, if the planet were a merchant bank, we know the major parties would act extraordinarily quickly, as we saw during the course of the financial crisis. Now, just to pause here, I mean, the Greens, we did support the stimulus package and would do so again in a second, because it's clear the evidence from the economists is that had that not been the case, country would have slid into recession and we'd be facing double-digit unemployment. But the point is that I just wish that the major parties would extend to the planet the same courtesy that they extend to the merchant bank and act as quickly and with such international and cross-party collaboration. To get back to what this means for here and now, we really have a short period of time within which to turn things around if we're to meet the climate challenge. But here's where I guess I'm optimistic about a third voice being able to advance a new politics that puts our society on a footing based around values like sustainability, care, compassion and equality. And I think we can do it while drawing on the lessons of the 20th century. And I want to refer here just to one other major political achievement as a point of reference: space travel. I want to just read, if I can, from one of my favourite blog posts from a writer called Jodie Dean. She wrote, "Men walked on the moon because there was a collective commitment to a common project. A project for the good, not just of engineers and patent holders, not just for a political party or ideology, and not just for the nationalist aspirations of a particular nation. The Apollo project boldly projected the we of a common humanity, aspiring to break the bonds of particularity and reach beyond our imaginations. That we, that aspiration, has since been sold short, sold out, remained at way below discount prices. Instead of common dreams, we got greed is good, self-centred neoliberalism and an identity politics that couldn't see past identities it already knew and naturalised fantasies. We got the worst of individualism, an individualism that thinks cost is a good excuse for letting people rot of cancer, that thinks extreme inequality, winner takes all, is the only motivation for work, and that perversely has been able to convince too many people that this way of thinking is ethical. Will we ever wake up and dream again? That blog post is entitled, "We were promised the moon, we got lolcats instead." As a fan of lolcats, I think she's being a bit harsh, but I think you get the point. And I think we also have to be a bit careful to remember that idea of space travel was intricately bound up with Cold War and, of course, the arms race. But what was offered in that was a goal, a commitment to a plan, and a dream. And that's what I suggest we need again today. A plan or a vision is important not because it should be imposed from above, but rather it's the very act of thinking about how things concretely could be different that holds the door ajar. It's a map guiding a path to safety. A plan of possible concrete action, of sending someone to the moon or perhaps having a world powered solely by renewable energy in a decade, functions itself as a reminder that the values we already hold as important can be spread across the country. And that's why I'm excited that groups like Melbourne University, for example, recently Beyond Zero Emissions and also the Greens, released a plan recently to show how within 10 years Australia could be powered by renewable energy. And I think those documents like that are arriving on the scene at exactly the right time. And I also think it's important, thinking about the two-party system and where we go from here, to avoid nostalgia. Instead of simple wishes for a past that never really delivered what we wanted, the task is now to create an alternative vision of the good. Why not, for example, an open source collective plan to create and own a renewable energy infrastructure, where the details of the plan are not set from the beginning by Vanguard, but collective development is itself an integral element of the project? Why not the generation of multiple local electricity plants owned and run by streets and neighbourhoods? A high-speed rail from Melbourne to Sydney? An economics that addresses the climate crisis by displacing paid labour from its privileged role and instead organising the economy around care, something we're going to need to pay particular attention to with an ageing population. Maybe a national renewable energy network the same scale as the broadband plan. A snowy hydro for the 21st century that invokes planet building as a new goal in lieu of nation building. For a rare moment, we now all have to become knowledgeable on these questions and partake in a debate. And that's why adding a third voice to the two-party system at the moment is so important. If it's left to the two major parties, there won't be any vision. Instead, they'll cook up another deal like the Labor-Liberal CPRS emissions trading scheme that was presented to Parliament, a scheme which didn't see Australia's emissions reduce until 2035 and which no major environment group supported. We know that the Liberal Party stands for climate denial, but the Labor Party is where progressive voices go to get silenced. Melbourne had the fourth most senior minister in the country, hailing from the left faction, and he wasn't able to turn the party around. And just look at Penny Wong's pronouncements over the last few days, or the fate of Peter Garrett. For so long as the two-party system dominates, we will find ourselves election after election, faced with an uninspiring choice between visionless parties stuck in the 20th century, unable to meet the challenges of the climate crisis, the transport crisis or the care crisis. And unless we change the dynamic, Labor will think it only ever has to compete with the Liberals and will inexorably move further to the right. In Melbourne, voters have a unique opportunity to break this dynamic. If only 1 in 10 people who voted Labor last time switched their vote to the Greens, we'll make history and elect our first ever Greens member at a general election. And the Greens, as a third party, are on the rise. Last time, more than 1 million Australians voted for the Greens. And taking the voice of those Australians to the House of Representatives, where government is formed, will shake up national debate. Not only will all eyes be on us, giving us the platform to shift the debate right across the country, but it will hold what is likely to be a Gillard government to account. And if seats start changing hands in this country, not on the basis of who can be the toughest on boat people, or who can ignore climate change the most, or who can censor the internet the best, or who can be our most vigilant moral police, but instead who has the best vision for transitioning Australia to a clean energy economy, who will promote social freedoms the best, whose refugee policy is most in conformance with international law and the facts. Once that starts to happen, we are going to see the greening of government. And although, if elected, I might be the first Greens in the lower house, I reckon I won't be the last, and it'll only be a couple of elections before I'm joined by others. And new voices in Parliament from a third party will lead to a more collaborative, constructive approach. As is the experience elsewhere, it forces parties to cooperate. And that cooperation can bring about a stability and a consensus that's much more enduring than that generated by 100-odd randomly picked people from the phone book sitting in some citizens' assembly. This election is going to shape the parliament that will deal with climate change, and that's why we need as many Greens there as possible. We have two old parties whose visions and records are so disappointing. Melbourne can be the circuit breaker that shifts the debate, puts some vision back into politics and places the values of sustainability, compassion and equality back on the national agenda. Thank you.